Welcome, champions, to the next overview and tier list ranking for any new or reworked champion for the current event active for idle champions. This is where we'll break down their mechanics and place them in my overall tier list for every champion in the game. But let's take a quick look at my cat while I remind all of you that I'm streaming on Twitch. Stop in and check me out playing any RPG I might be doing at the time, or come watch me stream idle champions the same day I release these videos. This event is going to be a little different than the average, since we have two whole new champions this time around, Volo and Sheila. This week we're getting Volo, and next week we're getting Sheila. So we'll cover Volo today, and join me in a week to talk about Sheila. So let's dissect Volo, the chaotic good human wizard in Seat 9. He serves the group exclusively as a support. His basic attack is a magical attack that will target the nearest enemy, and his ultimate will have him just chill for a bit, 15 seconds, causing his buffed allies to deal additional bud-based damage for the duration. So how does Volo buff? Well, let's take a look at his formation abilities. Hey guys, this is Tyredack in post-editing, and I realized I completely forgot to mention he has the formation ability to always be available for Grand Tour, so yay! His bread and butter is going to be Volo's Guide to Combat, where he increases the damage of all champions in the two columns in front of him. But he has a lot of ways to scale it up. For instance, he has Volo's Guide to Questing, where Volo increases the effect of his Guide to Combat by 10% for each guide and/or collection quest completed, stacking multiplicatively. This can stack up decently high, but it isn't scaling with the pre-stack or anything like that. But talking about pre-stacks, Volo's Guide to Monsters, he will count each type of enemy encountered in the current adventure. Volo increases the effect of Guide to Combat by an amount that scales with the pre-stack from equipment for each enemy type encountered throughout the current run, stacking multiplicatively. And then he also has Volo's Guide to Rapid Retreats, where if a champion in the column in front of Volo is defeated, the formation immediately retreats to the previous area. Upon returning to the area of their near defeat, the effect of Volo's Guide to Combat is increased by 1000% in that area. But you won't be able to scale up this effect other than Feats, so it's never gonna get that high. Now we're led to his Specializations. Each of them is a way to further scale his Guide to Combat, and is yet another one that scales with the pre-stack. So overall, once we're lining everything up, his Guide to Combat is going to be a very girthy buff. And your options are Volo's Guide to Spirits Inspectors, where he gains the Hunter role, which is a new role introduced for people who interact with favored foes, and Undead become his own favored foe. The effect of Volo's Guide to Combat is increased for each champion in the formation with the Hunter role, and yes, of course, stacking multiplicatively. Then he has Volo's Guide to Brain-Eating Tadpoles, where he will increase his Guide to Combat for each Ceramorphosis stack the formation has, and yes, stacking multiplicatively. But there's a couple problems here. For one, he himself does not gain a Ceramorphosis stack, where he did gain the Hunter role from the previous selection, and he doesn't really fit into an absolute adversary team. If you use him, he'll really mess with Dirge plus Folk Hero from Will, because all of those roles get scattered about. And a lot of people would use Jaheira with absolute adversaries instead of Dirge, but he's in Jaheira's seat. So you would probably only use him with the AA when you're hit with restrictions. And lastly, he has Volo's Guide to All Things Magical, where the effect of Guide to Combat is increased for each champion in the formation with a magical base attack, stacking multiplicatively. So you're choosing between filling your formation with either Hunters, Ceramorphosis, or Magic, and you want to stack it as high as you can in your formation because this is a pre-stack buff to his already pre-stack buffed Guide to Combat. So if you have Guide to Questing, ramped up at least to a decent number, have encountered multiple enemies for Guide to Monsters, and don't forget with this ability, there are plenty of champions who can force spawn enemy types, like Esmeralda, Lae'zel, Dynahair, Imoen. Nixie can even spawn elementals with her Wild Magic Surge, and Turiel with Fiends, but in my testing Turiel's Rakshasa wasn't counting. so I had to use Esmeralda for Fiends. And again, this one is one of the pre-stacks, so you definitely want to stack it up. And have his pre-stack Specialization slotted in your formation, you're going to be looking at a really good positional buff from Volo. Now, what about his equipment and feats? Well, we've kind of gone over the equipment a little bit, but let's look at it. He's got 1 to increase all champ damage, 1 to increase his guide to combat, 1 to increase his guide to questing, 1 for his guide to monsters, which is one of the pre-stacks, an increase to his specializations, which is the other pre-stack, and ultimate attack cooldown. Overall, really good scaling to be found here. And his feats honestly aren't anything that interesting. The only mechanical one of intrigue here is the ability to increase the range of guide to combat by 1 additional column. Everything else you're going to want to focus on the pre-stacks when available. Which again, if we haven't covered it enough, that is the specializations and the guide to monsters. Now, what about his achievement and adventure variants? The achievement shouldn't be too bad, as long as you have some of the champions that can spawn additional enemy types. And in his first adventure variant, Volo starts in the formation and he cannot be moved or removed. Only Volo and champions in the 2 columns in front of him can deal damage. This isn't really going to be a restriction at all, as you want someone within the 2 columns so they can receive his buff. His second variant starts him in the formation and he cannot be removed, but he can be moved. In this one, Elminster joins the formation. Champions next to Elminster deal no damage as he distracts them by critiquing Volo. 1 to 2 random enemies spawn with each wave, which do not drop gold or count toward quest progression. The type of enemy is determined by the area you are in, with the enemy type changing every 10 areas. As I haven't run it yet myself, I do wonder if there are 10 enemy types to encounter here for his achievement. And overall, this one is going to suck a little bit because having a formation slot taken up is always going to be an annoying one to push deep with. His third starts him in the formation where he can be moved but not removed. 1 to 2 relentless undead spawn with each wave as well. When defeated, they get back up after 5 seconds. They do not drop gold or count toward quest progression. In this one, to parallel his specialization choices, he could only use champions with the Hunter role, absolute adversaries affiliated members, and also champions with a magic-based attack. So this is quite restrictive, but on the same hand there are going to be a lot of options, and there are plenty of people who even are focusing the absolute adversaries. So you have options. Still, it might be a little bit too restrictive for newer players to push really deep with. So what about his availability? It's not too bad, but it's not the best. For one, he's locked out of Vajra and initially locked out of Zariel as well, but he does have a feat that's attainable within his event that will make him count for Zariel. And similarly, he's locked out of the Day 1 Trials restriction for Constitution. So, 1 patron and 1 Day 1 unavailable, otherwise he's ready to go. So where does he deserve to be ranked? We've got someone with one of the better positional formation abilities in the game, since he's got 2 different equipment slots that scale with the pre-stack, while it also has other abilities that also scale it up. He's got good availability, but not necessarily the best. And considering the raw power he can get from that positional buff, but countered by the fact you're probably not going to be max stacks with both of his pre-stack abilities, you're really not going to be able to max out the favored foes as the game is now most of the time. And your formation is likely not going to contain all of his specialization options. All that being considered, he's going into the A-. But Tyredack, everyone's getting into the A tier these days. I know, but they keep throwing pre-stacks and good buffers at us, as well as just mechanically good. What can I say? Now, we can't wrap up this video without talking the potential flex slot options. So let's take a look at that. Working our way from top to bottom, first we have Zorbu. Overall a decent champion, can be used in a few formations, but doesn't have the best scaling. Then we have Nrak, who is overall a very useful champion, with very good buffing. But he's another one that scales better within his own kit than equipment, so again, not the best scaler. Then we have Black Viper, who definitely has a crowd that roots for her, as she does scale positional abilities as a DPS, but there are other DPS that are just better than her, and her feats are kinda trash. She definitely needs an update there. So unless you're for some reason looking at her to be your main DPS, you don't want to pick her up. There is something to be said about the shenanigans she can pull with Artemis plus Arkan, but still. Cisaspia is an interesting champion as she does have a pre-stack via her debuff, but she does need to stack it up and it's not going to scale to the crazy heights such as Volo's pre-stacks. And as far as debuffing goes, she's in a really competitive debuff seat. Ahem, Esmeralda, cough. Oriza I would recommend avoiding as she's not the best buffer and not the best DPS. And by that I mean she's actively bad in both. And Orkira used to be great and the queen of debuffs, but again, ahem, Esmeralda, cough. But still, she's not terrible. Then we have Desmond, who I would highly recommend if you are a Cass user. If you are not a Cass user, he's not going to perform as well for you though. Solok is alright if you're focusing on a ranged team, but other than that, I wouldn't recommend him. Dynahair is pretty good. She does have a pre-stack, but it's at a lower value, and while she used to be used in AA teams, with the launch of Minthara and Halcyon being in the same seat, that makes it a lot harder to justify using her over them. But still, she's not bad, and she does force spawn humanoids. And then we have Gale, another AA mention, but he's a lot like Karlach, where he scales more with his kit than his equipment. So if you're looking to just boost his equipment, obviously any item level helps, but you're not looking at a big scaler here either. So there's not a lot of options that are just hard pick slots. If you are a Cass user though, I highly recommend Desmond, who has a really well scaling pre-stack. As always, thanks for dropping in and checking out the video. Hit up that like, sub, and bell. Leave a comment on what you think about Volo. Check out my Twitch if you can, and or join the Tyredack community Discord, both links in the description. And as always, have a hell of a time out there, champion.